So looking at phase 3, the Kennedy doctrine, sometimes referred to as flexible response. So while the Eisenhower administration viewed containment through nuclear weapons by use of the strategy of massive retaliation, this is the Eisenhower doctrine, the Kennedy administration would introduce a third phase on containment, which was the ability to mount a flexible response, one precisely calibrated to meet actual situations on the ground as they arose. Hence, the first goal of the Kennedy administration was to build up the nation's armed forces. The purpose of this buildup was to create an alternative to Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation, right? So conflicts are going to arise, is basically a logic. We can't just rely on nuclear weapons. And otherwise, all bets are off. So Kennedy wanted to diversify, in many ways, the armed forces. So instead of responding to communist moves with nuclear threats, the United States could now recall on a wide spectrum of force, ranging from ICBMs to Green Berets. Thus, the new strategy of flexible response meant that the United States could choose among several operational plans in any given situation in fighting the Cold War. Kennedy's view on the Cold War and his desire for flexible response can be viewed by the following statement he made in 1961 when he, quote, promised to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty, unquote. So both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War were the results of Kennedy's promise. So let's take a look at Kennedy's inaugural address, this aspect of Kennedy's inaugural address.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
So this is Kennedy's promise, and again, this is coming off in context of the living memory of World War II, right? So never again. So although Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy helped create a political environment promising that this new generation is going to take that mantle, the baton has been passed. It was Johnson's fate to lead ourselves and to the world. The Cold War to Vietnam in Phase 4 from 1963 to 1969. These are the Johnson years. Now, the Vietnam War will continue after 1969 under the Nixon administration, but for Phase 4 we're looking at what happened with Johnson. The full-scale American involvement in Vietnam began in 1965 in a series of steps designed primarily to prevent a North Vietnamese victory. So just a little bit of background on Vietnam before we get into Johnson's fourth phase and how the United States got involved in the war in the first place. Vietnam is unique among the 11 nations of Southeast Asia, right? So here's Southeast Asia. because of its strong historical kingdom connections to China, as well as India. What is now northern Vietnam was ruled by China for more than 1,000 years, between the 2nd century BCE and the 10th century CE. So ethnic Vietnamese have been both attracted to Chinese ideas and at times anxious to resist Chinese political rule for their own people. The Chinese influenced northern kingdoms emerged around the fertile Red River Delta, where the national capital of Hanoi is today. So right around this area right here. So these kingdoms often rebelled against Chinese rule, and they eventually became stronger militarily than southern Hindu kingdoms ruled by Chams, who are linguistically related to Malays, which would be in this region of the world right here. The Chams built an Indianized Chapman kingdom roughly contemporaneous with Angkor, although today they are a small ethnic minority within Vietnam with a significant Muslim population. All right, so that's the background of Vietnam prior to Western civilization's influence within Vietnam. Now, fast forward many centuries later, the French began sending Catholic missionaries to the Vietnamese region beginning in the 17th century, when many of them were killed by Vietnamese emperors in the 1800s. The French government used their repression as a pretext for invasion and colonial conquest. So Saigon was seized by the French Navy in 1859. And during the following decades, the French repelled the Chinese, who's also considered Vietnam as theirs, and expanded French territorial control over what are now the nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So this was known as Indochina under French rule. They set the capital of Saigon in Vietnam's second fertile river delta region, the Mekong. So some Vietnamese communists today point to early anti-French communist groups that emerged in North Vietnam in the 1930s, but no serious nationalist or communist movements emerged before World War II. The Japanese invaded French Indochina in 1940, and as elsewhere, they claimed the slogan, "Asia for Asians." This revolutionary idea took hold throughout Southeast Asia, where local people were astonished to find out that their large and populous territories had been controlled by Europeans from relatively tiny and distant countries. So let me back up just a little bit before we get any further after Japan. It's also important to remember this gentleman here, Ho Chi Minh, who was a nationalist, a Vietnamese nationalist, who resented Chinese rule in Vietnam, and he certainly resented French rule in Vietnam. He certainly would resent Japanese rule in Vietnam. He wants Vietnam for Vietnam. What's important to keep in mind, too, is if we go back to World War I with the 14 points, part of the 14 points was that there should be an end to colonial rule, and countries should have self-determination. So this guy right here had took that quite seriously. So he went to Paris during the Treaty of Versailles to get on in these negotiations. Now, unfortunate for him, the people that were administering the Treaty of Versailles were Western European and Anglos from the United States, namely being President Wilson, who suffered from racism. And so this guy right here, in the eyes of Americans and Western Europeans, didn't afford the respect of self-determination and end of colonial rule. What he was asking for is the French to withdrawal from Vietnam post World War I. Now, this is kind of a what-if history, but if he had been listened to, a lot of the mess that happened in Vietnam probably would not have happened, including the fact that Vietnam would move into communist rule. So, again, from the perspective of the Vietnamese, communism sounds very appealing because the problem in Vietnam is that most of the land is privately owned by French landlords. They basically own large, vast rubber tree plantations and have enslaved the peasant community of Vietnam to work on those for below subsistence wages. And so, in order to hand Vietnam back to the Vietnamese, the handy solution during this time is to nationalize the rubber tree plantations. That is, the state takes over and redistributes the land to the people. And so this becomes Ho Chi Minh's political aims, pushing out the French, then the Japanese, and then later the Americans. So in 1941, the Viet Minh organization was set up as the League for the Independence of Vietnam. A banished, Ho Chi Minh, who was banished at this point, and was for being basically a European Marxist, returned from exile to join the Viet Minh and free Vietnam from imperialist European control. The Viet Minh quickly seized the north and central regions of Vietnam from post-war Chinese control, while the French reassumed control only of the south from the help of British forces. The first Vietnam War between the French-controlled south and the communist-led north began in December 1946, directly after World War II. Right? So the Viet Minh basically took advantage of French vulnerability, being devastated by World War II, and are declaring their independence, as is many colonial colonies of Western Europe are doing so. In 1954, the French withdrew, leaving Vietnam as independent but a divided nation. The French lost in this region of the world right here, Dien Bien Phu. They flew in a battalion of French paratroopers here, thinking that they would intimidate the North Vietnamese, but what they did instead was they made themselves an open target, and so the North Vietnamese just basically were able to slaughter French forces right here. And this was such a devastating blow, coupled with the devastation of World War II to the French armed forces, that they just said, uncle, and gave up. So the United States, which was funding basically the French's attempt to hold on to Vietnam, they began sending troops to fight the communists throughout the 1960s, bombing also, and eventually be bombing also neighboring Cambodia, right? So just keep perspective of what's going on from Vietnam's point of view is that first they were fighting the Chinese, then the Japanese, and then the French, and now here come the Americans to the rescue, and it looks like the Americans, from the perspective of Vietnam, is trying to reassert colonial rule in here to protect the rubber tree interest, right? And rubber tree is real important to American interests because they provide the basis for relatively cheap access to automobiles in the United States, right? You want to keep the parts of automobiles as cheap as possible, and one way of doing that is to have it in an area where labor is cheap and land is cheap to sell the millions and millions of tires necessary to piece together the automobile industry. From the American perspective, however, certainly this is going on, right? They are concerned about this particular industry, the rubber tree industry. But from their perspective, what it looks like going on in North Vietnam, which is endangering South Vietnam, is one more step in the Cold War. Right? It looks like, from America's perspective, they think the Soviet Union must be behind this. So fast forwarding to the Johnson administration, with the political situation in Saigon growing more hopeless every day, Johnson advisors urged the bombing of the North as the only conceivable solution. This would later become known as Rolling Thunder, where more bombs were dropped on North Vietnam than all of the bombs dropped in the European theater by American forces. So it was a heavy bombing campaign, in other words. American attacks would serve several purposes. They would block North Vietnamese infiltration routes, make Hanoi pay a heavy price for its role, and lift the sagging morale of the South Vietnamese. The airstrikes aimed at impeding the communist supply line and damaging Hanoi's economy proved ineffective. Johnson then authorized the use of American ground forces in South Vietnam, but he restricted them to defensive operations intended to protect American air bases. The Joint Chiefs under Johnson, as well as civilian advisors, then pressed Johnson for both unlimited bombing and the invasion of the North. Rejecting the clear-cut alternative of withdrawal or massive use of force, Johnson settled for a steady military escalation designed to compel Hanoi to accept a diplomatic solution. In July of 1965, Johnson permitted a gradual increase in the bombing of North Vietnam and allowed American ground commanders to conduct combat operations in the South. These decisions formed an open-ended commitment to employ American military forces as the situation demanded. Convinced that withdrawal would destroy American credibility before the world, and that an invasion of the North would lead to World War III with the Soviets and China, Johnson opted for a large-scale but limited military intervention. He believed that this country was weak compared to the United States, and eventually they would break. What he did not bring into his calculations is the determination of the Vietnamese. Again, this has been going on for 1,000 years. First, they've been fighting the Chinese, then the French, then the Japan, and it ain't nothing but a thing for the Vietnamese to fight Americans, right? The costs are too high for the Vietnamese to quit, compared to American soldiers who fought bravely and gallantly during this war. But from the American perspective, their goal, as far as individual soldiers, is to get through their stint, right? Whatever, it's a 6-month or a 12-month stint, and then go home and hopefully safely. For the Vietnamese, they were willing to fight to the last man, woman, and child in order to have national sovereignty, as would any nation, right? We would as well, right? If we had a foreign force in our country. So, moreover, Johnson feared the domestic consequences of either extreme. A pullout could cause a massive political backlash at home, as conservatives condemned him for betraying South Vietnam to communism. And this would happen again and again throughout the Cold War. Whoever was in power always feared the polar opposite. So if the Democrats were in power, they would fear Republican criticism of being weak in communism. If the Republicans are in power during the Cold War, they would fear Democrats or liberal attacks on the weaknesses of communism. So it becomes this dynamic that pushes American politics deeper into the Cold War, despite the consequences internationally. An all-out war, however, would mean the end of his social programs. He feared that once Congress focused on the conflict, as he put it, the bitch of a war would destroy his wife, as he considered it, the woman I really loved, the Great Society. So the Great Society was basically Johnson's promise to the American people to finish the job of the New Deal. And the goal of the Great Society, this is amazing, the goal of the Great Society, and American people believed this was possible, was to end poverty in the United States. And there was, this reflected the tremendous amount of optimism that post World War II America had at this time, right? We believe we could do anything. We believe we could end poverty. We believe we can go to the moon. We believe we could be the leader of the free world. We believe that a new era of humanity could manifest itself for the better under the leadership of the United States, right? And so this is post-World War II through the 1950s, through the 1960s, and into the Johnson administration. But it begins to unravel. This is real important to understand because this is very significant when it comes to the Vietnam War. It begins to unravel with the Vietnam War. So Johnson, between these two polar opposites of political pressure, right, looking weak on Vietnam and fearing to going to war with the Soviets or China over Vietnam, he settled for a limited war, and he committing by the end of his administration 500,000 American troops to battle in Southeast Asia, all the while pretending it was a minor engagement and refusing to ask the American people for the support and sacrifice required for victory. By 1968, what Lyndon Johnson once referred to as a raggedy-ass little fourth-rate country had brought the world's most powerful military giant to its knees. What's interesting about this whole process, in part, is to witness what Vietnam did to Johnson. Johnson was a very ambitious, very energetic, kind of good old boy from Texas, who is completely, by the end of his first term, diminished by the Vietnam War. And it's important to understand, I mean, this guy was an incredibly powerful senator who held a lot of sway from Washington when he stepped into the presidency after Kennedy's assassination. So he was a very powerful senator before he was part of Kennedy's administration. He becomes vice president. Kennedy's assassinated. He has that power, he has that sway, he has that influence in Congress. He's able to get a lot done domestically in the United States with the Great Society, with the Civil Rights Movement. But Vietnam just really breaks him down. This here is a clip, an address to the American people on television. It took the American public by complete surprise. Take a look at what he does.
With American sons in the field far away. With America's future under challenge right here at home. With our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day. I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes, or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
So basically, I quit. I'm tired. I can't do this anymore. Somebody else who has better clarity than I do, better leadership than I do, needs to step up. I'm out, right? He probably would have won the next nomination, even though it would have been a close race. American people did not see this coming at all.